He could walk again, but someone didn't want him to. The words echoed in her mind as she stepped out of the sleek black Range Rover, onto the red brick driveway of the Whitmore estate. The city of Johannesburg spread behind her like a jewel-studded quilt, glittering through the evening haze. Margaret took a deep breath. The air smelled of wet grass and freshly trimmed hedges, mingling with the faint perfume of the jacaranda trees lining the perimeter. This world was a far cry from the cramped, sun-beaten apartments she had known. The narrow streets where rent was due weekly in dreams felt like luxury items themselves. Here, money seemed to bend reality, shaping life as if it were clay in the hands of the powerful. Elaine Whitmore met her at the door, tall, graceful, impeccably dressed. Every movement she made seemed deliberate, polished, as though the entire world had to be aware that she was in it. Her smile was both welcoming and exacting, a combination that made Margaret want to lean in but also step back. "You must be Margaret," Elaine said, her voice smooth, velvety, but carrying an undercurrent of command. "We've been expecting you." The first time Margaret had met her, she'd been cautious. There had been hesitation, the kind that made her glance around for exits. But this time, she felt something deeper, a sense of inevitability. Some opportunities, rare as they were, demanded acceptance, whether or not the heart trusted them. Inside, the house was quiet. The kind of quiet that whispered secrets, where every step on the marble floor echoed like a confession. Margaret's eyes roamed across the hall, adorned with abstract art, contemporary sculptures, and priceless photographs capturing moments of privilege she would never touch. Yet despite the grandeur, there was a coldness, a meticulousness in the placement of every object, as if the house itself was a guardian of secrets. James lay in the grand bedroom, propped against satin pillows, his lower body motionless. He had the look of someone who had survived to find himself trapped in calm waters. His eyes, sharp and wary, followed Margaret as she approached, assessing her without words. She remembered the moment she first touched his wheelchair, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. "These are his medications," Elaine said, handing a small collection of vials. "Administer them daily. Even if he resists, you must ensure compliance." Margaret's fingers closed around the vials. Her mind flickered, asking questions she knew she shouldn't voice. Questions about purpose, about safety, about control. But the world of the wealthy had its rules, and obedience often outshone curiosity. "I understand," Margaret said, her voice steady. She had learned, through years of navigating the retail world, and the precarious edge of survival, that control was often exercised silently, and the consequences for disobedience could be invisible but devastating. Her first days were a rhythm of quiet routines. Early mornings began with preparing meals in the pristine kitchen, the sunlight reflecting off stainless steel surfaces and marble counters, illuminating the meticulous nature of this household. Each task had to be precise, medications crushed and mixed with care, trays set with clinical exactness, pillows fluffed to an exact angle, the wheelchair adjusted for perfect reach and comfort. James accepted her presence with polite distance, a cautious trust forming slowly, tethered to the consistency of her actions rather than the warmth of her words. Margaret observed him in silence, noting the subtle shifts in expression. The faintest twitch of fingers, the almost imperceptible bend at the knees when he concentrated. Every small motion was a triumph. Every glance an opportunity to reinforce his confidence. Yet, she could not ignore the shadow of contrast by Elaine. Her visits were clinical, evaluating everything with precision, her presence a constant reminder of the power imbalance in this house of luxury. Outside, the world sparkled with the wealth of South Africa's urban elite. Cars polished to mirror finish lined the streets, the scent of gourmet coffee and freshly baked pastries drifting from high-end cafes. The malls shimmered with designer labels, gold and platinum signage reflecting ambition and excess. Margaret had once sold handbags and fabrics to strangers, who spent in an afternoon what she earned in a month. Now, she walked among these streets as part of the inner circle, Yet the luxury felt both alien and a lens through which her life's hardships became magnified. One evening, as she returned to her modest apartment to collect a few personal items, she realized she had forgotten James' evening dose. The medication sat in the drawer of her room, the vials catching the dim light like amber stones. A pang of hesitation gripped her. Could she let one missed dose pass without consequence? She decided to leave it untouched. The risk felt smaller than the fear gnawing at her conscience. The following morning James moved. Not a reflex, not a fleeting twitch, but a deliberate shift, a faint bend at the knees. Margaret's breath caught. She had anticipated gratitude, excitement, perhaps even relief, but instead saw calculation in his eyes. A spark of life returning to a body that had dulled by chemicals, routine, and control. Later, Margaret confronted the pharmacist discreetly, her voice low as she asked about the medications. The answer sent a chill through her. They suppressed neuromuscular signaling. They weren't intended for home use. They could prevent recovery, keep someone weak, tether them to the present in a body that had the potential to move. The weight of understanding pressed down on her chest. What Elaine had framed as care was, in part, a cage. Margaret made a choice. She would not administer the medications again until she understood the full scope of what was happening. She would proceed carefully, quietly, without alerting those who thrived on compliance. For the first time, her role shifted from passive obedience to active responsibility. Days passed. Tiny improvements appeared in James' movements, a twitch of fingers, a fletch of fingers, a small lift of his foot. Evidence replaced assumption. Hope replaced resignation. Margaret's guidance became more than caregiving, it became empowerment. She encouraged him gently, asking him to focus on small motions, celebrating every victory. Elaine, perceptive as ever, noticed changes. Her visits carried a new tension, a subtle tightening around her eyes as she scanned for irregularities, for lapses in compliance. Margaret met her gaze with calm, silent defiance. She had learned that control often relied not on brute force but on the perception of obedience. One golden afternoon, sunlight streaming through the tall windows, Margaret positioned James for a focused exercise. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. He nodded, muscles tense with concentration. Slowly, deliberately, he shifted his right foot then left. A smile broke across his face, faint but undeniable. "They're not dead," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your muscles aren't dead, they've been suppressed." James stared, disbelief mixing with a rising tide of hope. "Then, it wasn't supposed to help." Margaret shook her head. "I don't know her intentions but I know the effect. And now you have a choice. You can take back what's yours." The next morning, Elaine arrived, poised and polished, expecting the same obedient, compliant man. She found subtle resistance, small triumphs hidden in measured movements. Margaret's silent confidence communicated more than words could. Control, she realized, was fragile when faced with courage and consistency. James leaned back in his chair, eyes bright with the spark of regained autonomy. "I won't let her take over my company, my life or my body," he said. "Not anymore." Margaret smiled, a mixture of pride and relief washing over her. The mansion, the wealth, the curated silence. It no longer intimidated them. Luxury was no longer a cage but a backdrop against which resilience, courage, and human will could assert itself. South Africa's sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the manicured gardens of the Whitmore estate. The city below twinkled with promise and danger alike. In this world of opulence, of inherited power and hidden intentions, two lives had intertwined, not by wealth or position, but by the choice to defy control, to reclaim strength and to step into freedom. Hope, Margaret realized, was not a gift granted by luxury or fortune. It was a quiet revolution that began in the small, defiant choices of those willing to see through deception and act. And for James, for her, and for anyone trapped by circumstance, the first step had always been the hardest, but it was also the most transformative. The days that followed carried a new rhythm. Margaret no longer approached her duties with the cautious passivity of a newcomer. Instead, Every step she took, every movement she guided, was deliberate, calculated, and infused with purpose. The mansion, which had once seemed like a polished cage, became a theater for subtle revolution. She learned the layout intimately. The weight of the doors, the echoes in the marble corridors, the way sunlight shifted across the polished floors at different hours. Every detail was a tool, every shadow an ally. James grew stronger, though the change was gradual. Each morning he tested his limbs with micro-movements. A finger flick here. A slight lift of a shoulder there. Margaret celebrated each victory, no matter how minute, because they were victories in a war he hadn't even realized he was fighting. Elaine's presence, precise and unyielding, still hovered like a storm cloud. Margaret had observed her closely, noting the way her eyes scanned. The way her lips curved when a statement carried double meaning. She didn't trust Elaine, and for the first time, she felt no need to. One evening, after James had completed his exercises and reclined in the chair near the French windows, the sunset spilling gold and rose across the manicured lawns, he spoke quietly. "You know, when I first met you, I thought you were just doing a job. I didn't understand you. I thought perhaps you were like the others. Following instructions, afraid to question." Margaret shook her head, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I'm not afraid of questions. I'm afraid of silence. Silence can hide anything. I've learned that the hard way." James smiled faintly. The first time it seemed genuine and unguarded. "And I've been trapped in silence for years. Trapped in quiet control. I didn't know it until you showed me what it felt like to have a choice." The mansion's opulence, the curated stillness. Even the glinting chandeliers overhead could not dim the warmth that had begun to flow between them. Not romance, not yet, but a shared sense of purpose. Margaret had become more than caretaker. She was a partner in a subtle reclamation of life that had been systematically suppressed. Elaine, however, remained a force to reckon with. She began to arrive earlier in the mornings, her tone crisp, her instructions pointed. "Consistency is key. I expect precision. Any deviation could jeopardize his progress." Her eyes lingered on James longer than necessary, and Margaret's heart tightened. She knew, with an instinct honed over years of reading human behavior, that Elaine's control was not just about care. It was about dominance, about establishing dependency, about keeping James tethered to immobility while she maintained authority. Margaret devised a system. She would administer only the medications necessary for stability, those that did not suppress movement or potential recovery. She documented everything meticulously, logging every movement, every slight bend of a joint, every twitch of a finger, and every time James expressed awareness of his body's capabilities. It was during one of these late evenings, while the city lights of Johannesburg blinked like distant stars against the twilight sky, that James surprised her. "I want to try walking," he said quietly, almost as if voicing the thought might invite punishment. Margaret looked at him, feeling both fear and exhilaration. "We'll start small," she said. "One step at a time, only as much as you can control." The next day, she set up a series of exercises in the sunlit hallway. Cushioned mats lined the floor, and she positioned a sturdy walker in front of him. She guided his hands to the handles, instructed him to lift his legs with careful precision, and counted each attempt aloud, celebrating small victories with encouraging smiles. The first attempt was a wobbly step forward, almost collapsing under the weight of uncertainty. Margaret's hands hovered close but did not assist unless necessary. James' face of a canvas of determination, fear, and raw emotion. Again, he whispered, with her guidance, he took another step, then another. Each movement chipped away at years of forced immobility. Each breath reasserted a claim over a body that had been controlled for too long. Elaine arrived unexpectedly that afternoon. Margaret felt her pulse quicken as she watched Elaine's expression shift, subtly from satisfaction to something unreadable. "How are we progressing?" she asked. Her voice was smooth, but there was a hint of curiosity edged with apprehension. James, emboldened by Margaret's quiet support, took another step forward. Margaret's heart leapt. Elaine's eyes narrowed, her composure intact, but Margaret sensed the calculation behind the mask. This wasn't just a woman overseeing recovery. This was someone measuring influence, testing boundaries, gauging leverage. I think we should continue," Margaret said softly. "Gradually, with support. He's responding." Elaine nodded, her smile polite but controlled. "Of course, we must ensure safety." Her gaze lingered a moment too long, and then she was gone, leaving a silence that felt almost conspiratorial. As days turned into weeks, James' mobility improved. Each movement was a declaration of independence. Each bend of a knee a quiet rebellion. Margaret continued to withhold the suppressive medications, documenting every positive change and every instance of discomfort or strain. The city outside mirrored their private struggle. Johannesburg's skyline gleamed against the afternoon sun, a symbol of opportunity and excess. The streets hummed with life, luxury cars weaving past boutique hotels, fine dining restaurants exhaling aromas that spoke of wealth and indulgence. Margaret sometimes wondered if the city itself understood the drama unfolding within the walls of the Whitmore estate, a battle, not with wealth or power, but with resilience, courage, and the human will to reclaim freedom. One evening, after another successful session, James leaned back in his chair, exhausted but triumphant. "I can feel it," he said, voice low, all lacing every syllable. "The strength in my legs, I think I can walk again." Margaret's eyes filled with tears she did not attempt to hide. "You will," she said firmly, "but only at your pace. Every step is yours. Not hers, not anyone else's." The days that followed were meticulous. Margaret created a routine that balanced exercise, rest, and encouragement. Every morning she guided James through stretches, balance exercises, and small steps with the walker. Every evening she documented progress, noting subtle improvements invisible to casual observers, but monumental to those who understood the mechanics of recovery. Elaine remained a shadow, entering at precise times, her presence both watchful and intimidating. She offered advice occasionally, always with an undercurrent of control. Margaret learned to navigate it, maintaining a calm exterior while subtly guiding James toward independence. The mansion itself seemed to respond to their small rebellion. Rooms that had once felt cold and oppressive began to feel like spaces of possibility. The sunlight streaming through tall windows illuminated their efforts, and the gardens outside, once a backdrop of wealth and control, became symbols of growth, patience, and quiet triumph. James' confidence grew alongside his physical strength. He began to take the initiative, suggesting exercises, testing movements without prompting, and celebrating small victories with genuine smiles. Margaret watched, her heart swelling with pride. This was more than physical recovery, it was a reclamation of self. A revival of spirit, a challenge to the quiet tyranny of control that had dominated his life. Elaine's visits became more calculated. She noticed the progress, of course, but she could not touch it, could not reverse it. Margaret and James had found a rhythm, a silent agreement, a partnership forged in patience, courage, and trust. The power that had once seemed absolute now faced a force it could not predict: determination. Margaret knew the final steps would be the hardest. Relearning to walk was not just about muscles, it was about confidence, trust, and overcoming years of imposed limitation. Each step forward was a test. Each hesitation a challenge. But James was ready, and with Margaret guiding, he began to see a future not defined by control or dependency but by choice, strength, and freedom. Weeks passed, and the mansion felt less like a gilded cage and more like a proving ground. Every corridor, every marble stair, every sunlit window became a stage for subtle victories. Margaret had learned to anticipate Elaine's timing, to navigate her sharp observations without drawing suspicion. She had become adept at hiding the small triumphs, at letting James' movements appear incidental rather than deliberate. James' legs had grown stronger. He could now support his weight on the walker for several steps, his balance improving with each attempt. Margaret celebrated these wins quietly. aware that outward celebration could invite scrutiny. Every inch he gained was a step toward freedom, a challenge to the control that had ruled him for so long. Elaine noticed, of course. Her visits became more frequent, her questions sharper, her gaze more calculating. "Consistency is non-negotiable," she said one morning, her eyes flicking toward the walker that James now used with more confidence. "Even small deviations can have consequences." Margaret smiled politely. The practiced calm of someone who had mastered the art of silent resistance. "I understand," she said, carefully not revealing the truth of the progress he had made outside her watch. She knew Elaine measured not just actions but perceived obedience, and she refused to feed that perception with anything more than carefully curated compliance. In the afternoons, when the sun hung low over the city of Cape Town, casting amber light over the estate's gardens, James began to walk short distances without the walker. At first, it was a few steps from the bed to the armchair, then across the polished floors of the living room, and finally toward the wide French doors that led to the gardens. Each attempt left him breathless but triumphant. Margaret followed close behind, her hand hovering near his back for support, though rarely touching him. One evening, as the sky blushed with pink and gold, James paused in the garden, the scent of jasmine and freshly cut grass filling the air. He turned to Margaret, eyes bright with determination. "I can feel it," he said, voice low but steady. "I can really feel my legs." Margaret nodded, tears mulling but unspilled. "It's your strength," she said. "You've been patient, persistent, and brave. That's why this is happening. Not me. Not anyone else. You." For the first time the mansion felt warm. The wealth, the polished surfaces, the curated stillness, they no longer intimidated. It was a stage for recovery, not oppression. James' newfound confidence radiated outward, reshaping the very walls around them. But Elaine remained a shadow, a reminder that power could still loom large. One afternoon, she arrived unexpectedly, moving through the halls with that same controlled elegance. Her eyes scanned James sharp, assessing, calculating. "I noticed some changes," she said, her tone casual but laced with scrutiny. "We need to ensure there's no strain, no setbacks." James met her gaze, steady now, no longer timid or hesitant. Margaret stood beside him, silent but firm. The subtle shift in their demeanor, a combination of confidence, careful planning, and measured defiance, was palpable. Elaine sensed it immediately, though she did not reveal her discomfort. Control relied on perception, and this perception was slipping. That night, in the privacy of the estate, James took a moment to speak candidly. "Margaret," he said, voice heavy with emotion, "I don't know what I would have done without you. I thought I would be trapped forever." Margaret shook her head. "You were never trapped, James. You just needed someone to remind you of what you already had. Your body, your mind, your will, they were always yours. They just needed permission to move again." Days turned into weeks, and the exercises became more challenging. James began to climb the wide marble staircase, one step at a time, hands gripping the railing, muscles straining, yet determination lighting every movement. Margaret documented each session meticulously, logging progress, noting setbacks, and celebrating milestones quietly. Elaine's visits became tense. She observed James' growing independence with a keen eye, her polite smile never quite reaching her eyes. She questioned routines, double-checked medications, and lingered in ways that made the air in the mansion feel thick with scrutiny. But the momentum was unstoppable. James' confidence and strength grew daily, powered by determination and Margaret's unwavering support. One morning, sunlight spilled through the tall windows, illuminating the polished floors. James stood at the edge of the living room, unsupported, arms raised for balance. Margaret held her breath. He took a step forward, then another. His legs, once lifeless under the weight of suppressive medication, now carried him with measured strength. A smile broke across his face, awe and disbelief mingling in equal measure. Elaine arrived later that afternoon, her presence sharp as ever. She approached with her usual composed demeanor, but her eyes flickered with something new: suspicion, curiosity, perhaps even fear. "James," she said, voice smooth but wary. "Shall we begin your exercises?" James shook his head, standing tall, legs firm beneath him. "No," he said, voice confident. "I've done my exercises. Today I walk on my own." Elaine paused, her expression unreadable. Margaret stood beside James, silent but resolute. The mansion, with all its wealth and authority, could no longer dictate the limits of his life. Each step he took was a declaration, a reclaiming of autonomy, a challenge to the carefully curated control that had dominated his existence. The first steps were slow, deliberate, measured. Margaret followed close behind, ready to catch him if necessary, but allowing him the freedom to move independently. Each movement was a triumph. Each breath of victory over the years of imposed limitation. By the time he reached the French doors, stepping into the garden bathed in afternoon light, James was walking steadily, confidence radiating from every motion. Elaine watched from the threshold, silent. The control she had relied on, the influence she wielded through fear and compliance, had been quietly dismantled by courage, patience, and resilience. Margaret had guided the reclamation of a life that had been suppressed, demonstrating that true power lay in wealth or authority, but in support, trust, and unwavering belief in potential. James turned to Margaret, eyes gleaming with gratitude and triumph. "I never thought I'd walk again," he said. "Not really. But now." His gaze swept over the gardens, the mansion, the city beyond. "And I will." Margaret smiled, a mixture of pride, relief, and quiet victory. "You already are," she said. "Every step you take is proof." The mansion, once a symbol of opulence and control, had become a stage for transformation. The polished floors, the tall windows, the meticulously curated silence, all bore witness to a story of courage, determination, and the human will to reclaim autonomy. In the evenings, Margaret would watch James practice walking across the gardens, the wind lifting strands of hair, the sun painting gold across his determined face. Each movement was a celebration of life reclaimed, a testament to resilience, and a reminder that freedom could never be taken for granted, no matter how luxurious the cage. Elaine's influence, though still present, had been challenged and reshaped. Margaret had shown, without confrontation, without anger, that true control could not exist where there was trust, autonomy, and courage. And in this quiet victory, James found not just mobility, but dignity, independence, and hope for a life defined not by limitation but by choice. The weeks that followed were a quiet storm of determination. Every morning, James awoke with the resolve to challenge the limits that had been imposed on him. Each day, the mansion seemed less like a gilded prison, and more like a proving ground, a theater in which courage and resilience performed. Margaret orchestrated his exercises with precision, gently pushing boundaries while ensuring he never overextended himself. She celebrated each small victory, as though it were a grand triumph, because to James, each twitch, each bend, each step was indeed monumental. James began to walk longer distances across the estate. The hallways that once echoed with careful silence now resonated with the rhythm of deliberate movement. At first, it was only a few steps unsupported, but soon he moved across entire rooms, his balance steadying, his confidence growing. Margaret followed, not hovering, not controlling, but supporting invisibly, her presence a quiet encouragement. Elaine, as always, arrived in the afternoons. Her eyes measured, her posture immaculate, her voice smooth but edged with scrutiny. She asked questions, tested routines, monitored progress, but Margaret had learned to mask the truth. Every success James achieved was carefully framed as minor, coincidental, or precautionary in Elaine's view. The control she had once willed through fear and medication was slipping quietly, imperceptibly. One evening, as the South African sun dipped low over the Cape Town horizon, painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold, James paused in the garden, catching his breath. The wind lifted the scent of jasmine and freshly mown grass, carrying it across manicured lawns. "Margaret," he said, voice steady, "I think I'm ready. Ready to try walking without support, across the garden, all the way to the fountain." Margaret's eyes widened, a mix of pride and concern. The fountain was a considerable distance, a stretch of polished stone paths lined with hedges and flowers, but she knew he could do it. "All right," she said, calm but resolute. "But remember, every step is yours. Take it slowly, focus on your balance, and I'll be right behind you." The first step was careful, measured, deliberate. James' muscles protested, remnants of years of forced immobility twanging with resistance, but his mind was firm. Margaret's hands hovered close, ready to catch him, but he did not need it. Step after step, he moved forward, his body learning the rhythm of independence. The wind tugged at his hair. Sunlight gilded the edges of his determined face, and with every movement, he reclaimed a fragment of himself that had long been held captive. Halfway across the garden, Elaine appeared at the edge of the fountain. She had arrived unexpectedly, her posture immaculate, her eyes sharp and assessing. "James," she said smoothly, "remember your exercises. Consistency is critical." James froze for a moment, the final stretch ahead of him. Elaine's presence had once invoked fear and compliance, but now it sparked resolve. He inhaled deeply, centering himself, and took the next step. And then another. Margaret followed, silent, her heart pounding in her chest, but her face composed. Elaine watched, her expression a mask, though behind it flickered something she could not control: recognition, unease, perhaps even fear. James reached the fountain. His hands lifted instinctively to touch its cool stone edge, and he turned to Margaret, eyes bright with triumph. "I did it," he whispered, disbelief and joy mingling in his voice. Margaret smiled, tears threatening to spill. "Yes," she said softly. "You did every step, every inch. It's yours. Not hers. Not anyone else's." Elaine's eyes narrowed, her composure tight, controlled. "You've exceeded expectations," she said, voice smooth but clipped. "But remember, progress requires oversight." James' gaze met hers, steady and unflinching. "I've had oversight my whole life," he said quietly. "I've had control taken from me. Movement dictated, independence denied. Not anymore." Elaine's lips pressed into a thin line. Margaret could feel the tension, the shift in the room. Authority and wealth could dictate comfort, control, and compliance, but they could not dictate willpower, courage, or resilience. James had reclaimed what had been his all along: his body, his choice, and his dignity. That evening, as the mansion settled into its quiet grandeur, James walked through the halls unassisted, each step a statement. Margaret followed close, silently documenting, her pride unspoken but palpable. The air in the estate seemed lighter, warmer, no longer oppressive. Over the next days, James' confidence grew. He began to explore the estate independently. Walking to the library, the sunroom, the private art gallery. The mansion's opulence, the polished floors, the ornate chandeliers, the expansive gardens, no longer intimidated him. It became a landscape of opportunity, a testament to what determination and Elaine's could achieve. Elaine's visits became more tense. Each word measured, each glance sharp. She attempted to maintain authority, but James' independence had altered the balance. Margaret had taught him not just how to move, but how to trust himself, how to reclaim the agency that had been denied. Authority without consent was powerless, control without courage could not persist. One afternoon, as the sun spilled golden light across the main hall, Elaine confronted them directly. "You've made remarkable progress," she said, voice calm but edged with something unspoken. "But independence can be risky. There are responsibilities, risks, liabilities." James met her gaze, steady, unwavering. "I am capable," he said. "I can move, I can walk, I can decide. The risks are mine as are the rewards. No one can take that from me anymore." Elaine's eyes flickered, her composure fracturing for the briefest moment. Margaret saw it and knew the moment had arrived. Control had been challenged, authority had been defied, and resilience had prevailed. From that day forward, James' independence became unstoppable. He walked freely through the estate, explored the gardens, and even began planning short trips beyond the property. Each movement was a celebration, each step a victory, each breath a reclamation of life once suppressed. Margaret, though quiet, felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had not only guided a body back to mobility, but had nurtured courage, fostered trust, and helped reclaim a life from the grasp of control and manipulation. The mansion, once a symbol of limitation, now stood as a backdrop to a story of resilience, empowerment and triumph. One evening as they stood together on the balcony overlooking Cape Town, the city lights twinkling like distant stars, James turned to Margaret. "I owe you everything," he said, voice full of gratitude and awe. Margaret shook her head, a smile soft but proud. "No, James, you owe yourself. I just reminded you who you are, and what you're capable of. The rest was always yours." The wind lifted across the balcony, carrying the scent of ocean and freedom. James' steps, once uncertain, now echoed with purpose. The mansion, the wealth, the silent authority of Elaine, all of it had been overshadowed by something far greater. Courage, resilience, and the unyielding human will to reclaim life. And as James walked into the garden one last time that evening, unassisted, unafraid, and unrestrained, the city stretched before him like an open canvas. Every step was a declaration, every movement a testament, every breath a victory. The mansion, with all its luxury and control, remained, but the story within it had changed forever. And in that change, there was freedom, there was freedom. And there was hope for the limitless possibilities of a life reclaimed. The days that followed were quiet, but the mansion itself seemed to breathe differently. James walked freely through every corridor, the polished floors reflecting a man who had reclaimed himself step by step. Margaret followed close, but not to guide. She walked alongside, a silent witness to the power of resilience and determination. The sun streamed through the tall windows, gilding the chandeliers and casting golden patterns across the marble floors, as if even the house itself was celebrating this reclamation of freedom. Elaine became a presence of measured distance. Her visits were still frequent, still precise, but her authority had lost its edge. She observed, noted, and occasionally offered advice, but there was no control, no silent threat, no power over James' body or will. She had attempted to keep him dependent, to dominate through fear and manipulation, but resilience cannot be caged. James had begun to explore beyond the mansion, taking short trips into the city. Margaret accompanied him at first, walking the streets of Johannesburg and Cape Town, the luxury boutiques, the cafes, the neighborhoods that had once seemed glamorous yet distant. Each step outside was a declaration of independence, each movement a triumph over years of imposed limitation. He marveled at the freedom of choice, the simple act of moving unassisted, and the thrill of being fully present in the world again. One evening, as the city lights shimmered over Table Mountain, James paused on the balcony of the Whitmore estate. The wind carried the scent of the ocean and the distant hum of life, vibrant and uncontained. Margaret stood beside him, quiet but steady, watching him inhale deeply, as if absorbing every detail of the life he had almost been denied. "I never thought I'd walk again," James said, voice soft but strong. "I didn't even dream of freedom, it felt impossible." Margaret shook her head gently. "You already had it inside you. I just reminded you, you've done everything else. The courage, the persistence, the strength, it was always yours." He turned to her, eyes bright. "And what about her?" he asked, referring to Elaine. "She tried to control me, to keep me weak. She had wealth, influence, authority, she could have stopped me." Margaret's expression was calm. "She had power, yes. But power is nothing without choice. You've learned that. You've reclaimed control. She cannot take that from you." In the following weeks, James' recovery became more than physical, it became symbolic. He returned to his company, walking confidently through boardrooms that had once seemed intimidating, meeting colleagues who had only seen him as a fragile figure. He took control of decisions that had been managed in his absence, asserting authority with quiet confidence, tempered by empathy and wisdom born from struggle. The mansion itself transformed. No longer a symbol of control, it became a space of life and possibility. Margaret guided James in subtle ways, ensuring routines were efficient but never restrictive, They worked together, a partnership forged in trust and shared purpose, blending independence with support. The gardens flourished, the corridors echoed with footsteps that were free, unbound, and alive. Elaine eventually confronted James in the main hall, a final test of authority perhaps, or perhaps a gesture toward reconciliation. "James," she said, voice measured, "you've exceeded all expectations. But independence carries responsibilities. You must not forget the care that has been provided." James met her gaze, calm, unwavering. "I do not forget. But care is not control. Protection is not imprisonment. I am grateful for guidance when it is needed, but I am no longer dependent. My life, my body, my choices, they are mine." Elaine's lips pressed into a thin line. She measured these words and recognized the inevitability of change. Control cannot persist where willpower has reclaimed itself. The mansion, with all its wealth and authority, was no longer a cage. It was a stage on which courage had triumphed. Margaret and James spent their days exploring, learning, and embracing the richness of life that had once seemed unattainable. They attended social events, exhibitions, and gatherings, moving seamlessly through spaces that symbolized South African luxury, opportunity, and influence. James' newfound mobility allowed him to experience the city as he had never imagined. Fine dining, art galleries, luxury boutiques. But he carried himself with humility, recognizing that freedom and wealth were distinct. One morning, as the sun rose over the estate, casting long golden shadows across the gardens, James took a final walk through the mansion, Margaret by his side. Each step was deliberate, powerful, and free. The hallways that had once echoed with silence now resounded with possibility. Every room, every corridor, every window bore witness to the triumph of human will. He stopped at the fountain in the garden, hands resting lightly on the cool stone. The water shimmered in the sunlight, reflecting a man who had fought for himself, who had defied control, and who had reclaimed life with dignity and courage. Margaret stood beside him, silent but present, a companion in victory and a witness to the extraordinary journey. James turned to her, eyes bright with gratitude and awe. "I am free," he said simply. "I can walk, I can live, I can choose." Margaret smiled, pride and relief mingling in her expression. "Yes, you are, and nothing can take that away from you." From that day forward, James walked into every aspect of life with confidence. The mansion, the wealth, and the authority of others no longer defined him. He had learned that freedom is not granted, it is claimed. Strength is not inherited, it is earned. Courage is not measured by absence of fear, but by the persistence to act despite it. And as the city of Johannesburg and Cape Town stretched beyond the estate, vibrant and alive, James' footsteps echoed with purpose. Every stride was a testament to resilience, determination, and the unyielding human will to reclaim life. The mansion, with all its luxury and control, remained, but the story within it had been rewritten. Triumph, autonomy, and hope now filled its halls, and a life that had been denied was finally, gloriously, lived.